Welcome to the .NET DocsShow with your hosts, Cam Soper, David Pye, and not the Scott we deserve, but the Scott we needed, Scott Addy. The .NET DocsShow starts now.
I really do miss that intro. We should do that more often.
We should. We should get Chase to record a new one.
Yeah, I just love the whole Scott Addy thing. Not this deserves. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, good greetings.
Well, it's afternoon for us. It's evening for our friends over there in the UK, but it's still technically morning for like half of our coworkers.
That's true. It's a good point. So,
but it's still 2020.
It's still,
oh God!
It's still it's March. It kind of feels like March, even though.
So in reality, who knows?
So we're super excited to be here. And Steve invited us on, and we're gonna do something special. So Steve, I know you wanted to share your screen.
Yeah, let's see if we can do that. Hopefully.
Ooh, that's a nice. Ooh, you got nice slides, man. I need to up my slide game. Holy cow!
You got to have the gradients in the slides. That's all the rage.
Awesome.
Well, thank you very much for hosting us on Twitch. This is a little different for those of us that kind of meet regularly as part of this .NET Southeast group. We don't normally do Twitch. We have been doing Zoom over the last few months because the world is crazy. And for the time being, we're not on Zoom on my old account because I've left the company that I was working for. So many of you will know I work at Magix or worked at Magix. I've moved on. I will be joining Elastic in a couple of weeks' time, where I hope to be able to take over their Zoom account for future events. But just a quick intro to the group and what we do. We meet regularly. Every month we try and get together, as I say, generally in person for the last couple of years, and then sort of the end half of this year. Obviously, we've moved to virtual events, and in the sort of future, when the world gets back to normal, and hopefully we all kind of exit out of this 2020 phase, we can kind of go back to some physical events again, and we can start kind of meeting up in person and socializing. But I think the plan is that we'll probably try and keep some aspect of virtual events as well. But if you haven't joined us before, you can follow us up on meetup.com, and you'll get notified whenever we start scheduling new events and new sessions. We have a Twitter account at .NET Southeast as well, so that's where we'll announce all of the sort of announcements about sort of upcoming events and any changes to schedules, things like that. And then on my side, if you want to reach out to me directly on Twitter, my DMs are open. I'm at Steve J. Gordon there. And if you have any ideas about people that you'd like to hear speak, or you'd like to join us and actually present at the event, we're more than happy to host you. So reach out to me there, and we can set that up. We do have our regular sponsors. So of course, Magix is still a sponsor for us. So when we go back to physical events, we will be still continuing to use the Magix office space once that's kind of safe and something that we can resume. So we might have to start with limited numbers, but when we can, we will get some in-person events going there. We do have our JetBrains sponsorship still. We haven't run the prize draw for a few months. I am still figuring out how we go about that in the brave new virtual world, but we will get back to issuing out some prize draws every month, hopefully. We have our regular discount code from Manning. So if you want to go and purchase any of the great Manning books, I know a couple of sort of friends of mine are working on new books at the moment that are out in their sort of early access programs. So Andrew Locke's got his second edition of ASP.NET Core in Action, which is progressing. And Chris Sainty has got his Blazor in Action book started on there as well. So if you want to go and purchase those early accesses, use that discount code. And of course, the .NET Foundation, who give us access to meetup.com and kind of help us get these events running. Kept the slides nice and short this time around. So I'm going to end there, and I guess hand over to some of my friends from the big mothership of Microsoft on the Docs team to take us through their site. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to add my screen here now. Yeah, so thank you very much, Steve. Steve's a longtime friend of mine, MVP, cohort for many years. So this talk is building the .NET Docs Show website. So we have a website that we stood up for the .NET Docs Show, and as part of that, this is kind of a special event for the user group where we're going to let you see behind the scenes, and it's really geared towards being more interactive. So at any point in time, if you have questions, being that we're on Twitch, feel free to post questions there and we'll raise them up and we can show them just like this. So there was a question earlier saying about .NET southeast of where? And so just like that, so we can share questions and we'll address them. We'll put them up on the stream, and so feel free to interact. Unfortunately, we have to do these things virtually now. I would have loved to have flown out to the UK to spend the evening with Steve. I'm sure it would have been filled with beers, laughs, and lots of .NET conversations. So again, feel free to ask questions. So as we progress through this,
wait, Dave, I have a question.
Yeah.
What's the .NET Docs Show?
Oh, well, the .NET Docs Show is basically it's an adventure. It's a play on words, and this is probably something we shouldn't have tried to been clever with, like the name itself. So being that we're part of the .NET Docs, we had this vision of being like doctors of .NET, and so we wanted to do a show. And I've got more with the slides here in a little bit about that show, but yeah, so we're doctors of .NET, even though we're on the .NET Docs team.
Sorry, I didn't mean to lead you.
Oh, no. That's totally fine. So my name is David Pine. You can follow me on Twitter at DavidPine7. Get lots of interesting commentary about the 7th iteration of David Pine. Yep, that's me. So I
totally skipped versions 1 through 6.
Yeah, those were beta and alpha versions. They didn't pass unit testing. So
I'm more concerned about the lack of a semantic versioning system.
I should have done that. That'd have been. I don't know if you can do dots, so that'd be fun. I used to maintain a blog. I don't really blog as much as I used to, but you can still find relevant content on davidpine.net. And all of the source code that I'm constantly slinging is out at iEvangelist. So as I mentioned, Steve and I go way back. We've had many fun occasions at the MVP summits through the years. I have arrows for all the times you see Steve and I. Here's another arrow pointing to Steve. Here's yet another one. This one's an animated GIF showing you some of the party great times. That's
the MVP summit, isn't it? Or
did
you say that already?
Yeah, the MVP summit. So the interesting thing about the summit is it's a time where the developer community comes together. And at this location at the mothership, as Steve said before, that's where a lot of the ideas came together for the three of us, Cam, Scott, and I. And Microsoft has what they call DevRel Camp. So developer relations gets together every February, and they celebrate all of their historical achievements, the things that they were doing. They share innovations, they share ideas for collaborating and things like that. And as part of that, when we got together, we were saying in February that we wanted to do a live stream. We wanted to start doing that. We've seen other people who were successful doing it, and we thought to ourselves, well, that can't be too hard. We were wrong. It's pretty difficult. Like it's a lot of work, but it's really pays off. It's so much fun. It's the best thing ever. And Scott and Cam, feel free to share your 2 cents there with that. But
I guess I would add to that, if you watched the first couple of episodes of the show and you're still watching us, first of all, thank you for sticking with us. But the other thing I'd point out is you would have witnessed in those first couple of episodes just how awful we were. We had absolutely no idea what we were doing. Not saying we're good now, but what I am saying is the quality has improved.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, that's the story. And we had someone here calling attention to the fact that I don't do slide decks very much. So 7 of 9, I added 4 slides for pictures this morning. The reason there's only that few of slides is because here's the meat of the content, the demo. So
I think the reference was to David Pine 7 though.
Oh,
because he said that when we were talking about.
Oh, okay.
version 6 through 7.
All right. I didn't know if that was like, I thought maybe it's slides. I only have like 9 slides.
But yeah, I think it's a Borg reference.
Yeah. So what I'm going to do now is share my screen, and
You are sharing your screen.
Well, share like not. Come on, you know what I mean. We're going to share the tooling. So Visual Studio, right? And this is where things get more entertaining. This is the meat of it. So I'm going to start rambling on about a bunch of different code here. And at any point in time, if you want me to like double click into something, or you're curious, or something doesn't necessarily make sense, again, use the chat feature there, ask the questions, or if you want to like poo-poo code that I wrote, because this is actually running in production right now. So it's totally valid to do that. Like, for example, we had John Skeet on a little while ago. This is the site, by the way, .netdocs.dev. And we had John Skeet on, and we did a live share session with him where he basically just ripped apart all of my date time service code, which was really, really entertaining. So this is kind of like one of those sessions where if you see something in here and you're like, what are you doing there? Why would you do that? Call it out. I'm curious. I want to know how I can make it better. And again, it's open source, so you could collaborate on it. There's a GitHub button here, and it's all open source. So this is the site. And what it does is basically it pulls all of our future and present and past shows from a Cosmos database instance. And we have like an admin screen where we can create these things, and we can now allow people to submit ideas for them and whatnot. And it's all using Blazor server side. So if you literally just were to do file, new project in Visual Studio 2019, you could work through the templates and do, an ASP.NET Core website and choose Blazor, and then have the server side option for the hosting. So there's a lot of questions that come into play with the server side hosted versus the WebAssembly. And that's just a difference in the hosting models. So server side is basically where the request response pipeline acts as it would, but instead of instead of being like the WebAssembly payload coming over the wire, and then your app being like a true SPA on the client side, it's rendered on the server. So the request comes through, the server gets it. It does its thing, renders some HTML, sends it back. And then what happens with server side specifically is that there's a SignalR channel that opens up. And that SignalR channel is configured such that there's duplex communication. So all of the deltas in your server side pages are updated. So as things change, for example, if we go back to the site, we actually have a countdown feature. This is using a .NET timer. And we're literally updating that, and that SignalR, the duplex channel, is sitting there. And as it ticks through, that event fires, and it sends those deltas over the wire, and things update on the client.
So, Dave, can you clarify a little bit what you mean about deltas?
Deltas. So differences in changes to the DOM. So the document object model here in the HTML. So the way that the HTML is structured. So there's this view of the world on your client browser when you have it, right? And as things actually change, those changes are communicated over SignalR, and those changes are a lot smaller than the initial payload, and those just cause updates here to the client side.
So what you're telling me here is that countdown timer is being is an object in memory at the server side, and the changes to the UI are what's getting streamed across the SignalR back channel, right?
Yep. Yeah. So that's the nice thing is, if you guys are to open up, oh, look at that, SignalR's acting up here. If you were to open this up on your end right now and see the .NET-Docs.dev website, our timers would be very, 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 very close to the exact same time, because again, that server is what's communicating those deltas out over SignalR. And instead of each client being individually responsible for updating their individual time, right, with like some JavaScript or stuff like that, based on their own calculations, it's all happening on the server and being pushed out to all the clients.
Gotcha.
So this is very common ASP.NET Core nomenclature, right? We've got a startup class, and this came from Owen and Katana, and a lot of these things are industry standard now, especially for .NET. They've become first-class citizens for how you would wire up dependency injection. So we have a service collection here, and we'll call configure services. So this is where we'll add all the various services for our application. So we're using memory cache. We've got server-side Blazor. This comes from the templating. Scott did a PR to add the SignalR Azure, so we have a backplane there. Scott, did you want to add anything about that specifically?
Yeah, so you know, full disclosure, you may be able to run a Blazor server app in production without something like Azure SignalR service. The reason why you would consider doing it is to scale up the app to service a larger number of concurrent SignalR connections. Because again, you're dealing with that WebSockets connection when using a Blazor server app. The alternative to Blazor server is something called Blazor WebAssembly. And with that flavor of Blazor, there would be no SignalR whatsoever. Therefore, Azure SignalR service is not needed. But again, because we're using Blazor server, we needed a solution up in Azure where this is hosted to serve as sort of a backplane or a proxy for those WebSocket connections.
Absolutely. And so we add many other things. We've got protected browser storage. This is actually a preview bits, but this was, I think they are propagating this sometime soon, but this is basically storage within the browser. So we can, from our server-side code, basically encrypt storage and make sure that we maintain state and stuff like that. We've got response compression, and then we have some things that are kind of custom to our application. So we're adding .NET DocsShow services. So if we go look at that, click into it, and where that brings us is to some service collection extensions. And this actually lives over in, I don't know why file tracking is not on, that lives over here in our services, our .NET DocsShow.services. And what it does is, given our service collection that we're extending, it requires a configuration object, and then we're adding 2 HTTP clients. We've got a Twitch service and a Logic app service, and they're each going to have their own configured HTTP client. And then we also have another service addition where we're adding Cosmos repository. So the Cosmos repository, this is actually a NuGet package that I created. It's available out there now. I was able to blog about it on the official Cosmos DB site. So it's an open source kind of side project, unofficial Microsoft thing. But what it does is it exposes the repository pattern for all of our POCOs that we want to interact with, and basically manages all of the, or encapsulates and abstracts away all of the complexities of the existing Cosmos DB .NET SDK, which I found to be a little bit kind of too verbose of an API for my liking. So I dumbed it down some because I'm not a smart person. And
so David, real quick, while you're on this in this file, a quick shout out to Steve Gordon for actually contributing the doc for the iHTTP client factory to docs.microsoft.com. And I thought of that because I was looking at lines 13 through 14 there, and I was reminded of the fantastic work that Steve did for us there.
Thank you. Yeah, it was an early contribution to the docs, and I recommend everyone that wants to have a go at contributing to an open source project, take a look at the doc stuff. If you see mistakes and errors, it's a good place to go and contribute.
Absolutely. And to that end, be very empathetic, because there's always people on the other end, right? So open source is amazing until you become someone who's hateful or upset and lashing out. Be mindful that there are people, these are all just people that are spending their, parts of their lives contributing to these things. So much appreciated.
And just so you know, if you're hateful to us on an issue or PR, we will screenshot it and make fun of you behind your back.
True story. So then we're adding Cosmos repository, and all that requires is an iConfiguration instance. And this goes out to my library. I'll add a link to the show afterwards and share some resources that way. But then we're configuring various things. So we're going to configure a strongly typed POCO here, and I name my things, whatever the contextual bit is, plus options. I know people will name it settings or configuration or other things like that, or whatever it might be. But I tend to name things this way. And as part of that, I've kind of adapted a long time ago. a bit of consistency with how I would expect things to be serialized. So if we have this Twitch options object, and imagine that I've got an app settings JSON file that we're sitting behind, I'm going to serialize that the exact same way. So I'm going to actually name those as such. So I can walk up to my configuration, get the section based on the type name itself. So the name of Twitch options, instead of having magic strings, because that's how I would expect it to be serialized. And that's just a convention that I came up with. I don't think it's actually something that is considered a best practice. In fact, other people will say not to do that. But then you get into naming conflicts. And if other people come into your project, one of my pet peeves is I want them to make it, be able to assume that things line up nicely. So it's just kind of a convenience for future proofing how things are mapped. So then we're adding some singletons. We've got a schedule service that maps to our iSchedule service. And this is basically just the decorator pattern using our iRepository of DocsShow. The DocsShow is a very, very simple POCO class that has a subclass of item. And it has all these different things about shows, right? We've got guests, we have hosts, we have tags, title, the URL, all these things. And in addition to that, we have our repository that exposes our functionality for interacting with those. And this is, again, an abstraction layer between the Cosmos DB.NET SDK and our service layer. And I'm just using the decorator pattern because it was very, very simple. I don't have any try-catch logic. If anything happens here, it just bubbles up. And these are all just represented as value tasks. So we can create shows, we can delete a show, we can get a show by its ID, we can get all shows given this expression, right? Based on a date time since a certain amount of time. We can update an individual show and so forth. So it's pretty straightforward. Not super complexing there, nothing magical. There's no rainbows or unicorns. And then we've got a date time service and a Twitter service. And again, these are all singletons, but this was just showing you some of that pattern, how we can have different layers of services where each service is really responsible for registering everything that it requires itself. So this is a pattern that's been kind of adopted with dependency injection and .NET Core holistically. So if we go back to our startup, you'll remember that's where we kind of started. So we said add .NET DocsShow services. That went out to our service library, and there was some extensions there, and it wired up all the things for those services. And then it relied on another library, and it was calling into some of it, those additions and configuring things itself. We also have a hosted service, and a hosted service is basically a way within our web app to have a background service that sits there outside of the context of the request response pipeline. So as requests and responses are coming through, we have a way for this service to sit there still in process, but not inside the request response pipeline. But what we can do is, since we have memory cache, we can kind of seed various bits of data and leverage this background service to hydrate records preemptively and update them as needed at our own pace, right? So since we're the admins and we know that the site doesn't very often update, we can, in the background, update things initially. When the app first fires and starts, this will happen immediately as the app launches. We'll basically hydrate our cache, and then that memory cache is then used for the rest of the site. That would then load up. So as individuals are coming to the site and they're asking for different pages of the site, they're getting all the information's coming out of the cache. We also have data protection, and we have lettuce encrypt. If you notice the spelling on that, inspired from Let's Encrypt. And Scott, wasn't there a story about someone?
Yeah, the backstory here is Nate McMaster created this as a side project. He was creating a NuGet package that integrated with Let's Encrypt. And long story short, there was a potential lawsuit that he'd be dealing with if he didn't change the name to something else. So he put a quick Twitter poll out there, and he said, what's something delicious that sounds like Let's Encrypt? And we landed on lettuce, the food. as something that sounded like Let's Encrypt.
Wait. Was that actually one of the qualifiers that it was delicious? Because I don't know what kind of lettuce you're eating, but it's a garnish.
I mean,
yeah, your mileage may vary. Certainly not iceberg lettuce. We might be talking about romaine lettuce or something like that.
That's really funny. Yeah. So yeah, get creative with names. I think that'd have been cool if they could have used like an emoji there, like the lettuce emoji. But yeah, so we're using. I'm opening up websites. Close that. So we're using Lettuce Encrypt, and we're using AutoMapper, and we're using Blazor Recaptcha. So I'm going to show you what this is all about. The Blazor Recaptcha is some fun stuff. So this is another little package that we created, and it's not public. It's not sitting in NuGet, but what it's doing is we've got this little Blazor component, which is its own little project that sits here. And we have, again, the same type of pattern where we have some service collection extensions. We're extending the iService collection. We're requiring a configuration, and we're adding the HTTP client, and we're configuring the Recaptcha options. So if you're curious, like what's Recaptcha? What is that? So before we get too far into this component, I'm actually going to walk out here, and we're going to try something somewhat interesting. This thing keeps going to sleep. I'm going to start this back up, and we're going to submit an idea. Actually, well, let's go back. Let's go home. Let's go to upcoming schedule, and let's look. And we can always delete this later, but so we have an from our site. If you go to the upcoming schedule, so we have all of our past shows. We have the one that is the next logical show in the order. So we're going to have Bree on next week, Monday. And then if you click here, this is a toggle that will show the upcoming shows. So these are the ones that are after that. So we've got a bunch of amazing individuals, future guests of the show. But we also have some gaps, and wherever these gaps are, these are opportunities for you as consumers to actually submit to be on the show. You can submit either yourself or someone else, as long as you have their consent. And then we'll work with them as hosts and say, hey, we'll have you on the show or not, right? And I don't think we've ever turned anyone away. But so we're going to submit a topic here for the February 22nd. And when we submit the topic, we get this little form. And it's a very simple form. We're using Bootstrap because we're amazing CSS designers. Who doesn't use Bootstrap? And what we do here is we expect, a title. So we're going to say Steve Gordon's amazing show, probably about ASP.NET Core with AWS. Well, maybe not. And then the idea, and you fill it out however you're going to fill it out, and the name, Gordon, and his email, whatever his email address is, right? We don't want to put that on there. I guess that'd be kind of it. I'll just put mine on there. You can email me. It's fine. And then your Twitter handle. I don't know that. J Gordon, is that it?
Yeah, you got it.
I feel like we need some more Scotts. Can we change that first name to Scott instead of
There
Steve?
you go, Scott. We can do that.
I need some more Scott in my life.
Scott J Gordon. That's perfect. I think that's actually a person probably. So now we have this Recaptcha. So this form has been filled out. And as you know, if you're familiar with Google, they have this Recaptcha. This is the I'm not a robot. And there's a bit of JavaScript that actually has to happen in addition to some HTML. Is there a question?
Well, I was just going to point out that this is the thing that where we're training Skynet to sabotage our traffic lights and crosswalks.
Beware. Skynet. Yes, absolutely. Skynet, be aware. So basically, it knows whether or not we're a robot based on our interactions, the way we've kind of interacted with this form, the way our mouse has moved. All of these different things are actually taken into account. And it's kind of creepy. So when we hit that, notice right here, this button is disabled, even though I can kind of stylistically change a little bit. It's actually disabled. I can't click on it. But I'm going to hit I'm not a robot. That's going to fire. And then it's going to send it off to Google. And Google's going to say, but you're actually not a robot. And that'd be kind of weird if it thought I was. And then I can hit send. And then now it's actually going to send that off.
Weird,
and
but
now,
understandable. I make the same mistake all the time.
So we have basically on the back end, when we hit send, it takes the form and it uses logic apps. So we're going to go into that in a little bit because there's some cool stuff with logic apps that I actually learned about from Cam. I didn't know about logic apps before that. But what it does is it takes this information and it just pumps it into a logic app. The logic app takes it as an HTTP request and it wires in with Outlook, sends an email to us, and we get an email with all of those things that we cared about from this form. And that's pretty cool. But the thing that I wanted to show off was that Recaptcha. So that entire process for the Recaptcha was pretty simple, right? It looked like just little, you click on it. And so that functionality comes from Google. And this is the component library for it. But I wanted to show you the actual markup first. So we've got a page. I think it's called like idea or submit. Here we go. Submit idea page. So in here, anyone's allowed to submit. And we allow anonymous, so anyone can submit these, and these are the ideas. This is actually a different submission page, but it follows the same type of thing. So within that, we have an edit form, and notice that the highlighting here, the syntax highlighting for the IDE is slightly different in that this is bold. And the reason it's bold and purple, I'm assuming purple because .NET, I'm assuming bold because it recognizes that as a component. So it's non-standard HTML. So div and h2, these things are stated, standard native HTML elements. But an edit form, first of all, besides blatantly breaking all of the common naming conventions of capitalization, the edit form is a custom component. And this is something that comes from ASP.NET Core's components forms namespace. So we have some methods that we can wire onto. These are event callbacks. We have some ways to annotate validators. We have validation summaries. We can do data binding, and this is all the Razor engine model binding syntax. But towards the bottom, we have the Recaptcha. The Recaptcha element has an evaluated function on it, and this is actually our event callback, and it gives us a tuple, and we have this function for evaluating it. So once it's been evaluated, we'll fire asynchronously on evaluated with that value and handle it. So let's go look at on evaluated real quick. On evaluated, you'll notice actually comes to our what I call code behind. So if we take a step back and look at this, we have our Razor markup, and you could have had like the @code directive within that markup, but I tend to try to avoid those for anything that's a little bit more complex. And instead, since our submit idea page is using the Razor engine, I know that submit idea page will actually generate a class which is hidden from us, but the Blazor team was smart enough to make that a partial class. So we can actually say public partial class submit idea page, and now these two things share that class.
As I remember, didn't web forms work the same way?
They very, very closely, yeah. So there's a lot of things that were learned through the different web stacks over the years. Some of the good things have been adopted, but one thing you're not going to see is is postback. Right. no more of that nonsense.
Right. And I was specifically what I was talking about was the ASPX being a partial class along with the code behind CS. Right.
Yep. So then what we do is, we have like this natural nesting here. We've got the Razor .cs file, and the IDE is smart enough to know that these things are logically cohesive. So it puts them and groups them together. So we have the ability to do injection. Instead of constructor injection, we can do property injection with this inject attribute. So we get navigation, we get our logic app service, we get a logger instance, and then we have parameters. And parameters are basically unique to components. So a parameter is something that can be passed in from the consumer of that component. So we got our show date, but we were looking for on evaluated. So on evaluated gets this tuple, which has a bool that says is valid, and if it's invalid, we'll have an array of errors. So once that happens, we're going to invoke it asynchronously, and we're going to deconstruct the tuple, and we're going to get our is valid and errors. And our Recaptcha is valid if it says the callback was evaluated as valid. And if it is, we are done then right away, right? So this basically just walks out, and there'll be an update though that is sent over SignalR, because we're going to change the state of this component. We're going to say, is Recaptcha valid equals true, presuming it was false before, because that's the default state. So when this form is initially shown, it's false, and our submit button is disabled at that point in time. So if we go back and look at the actual markup, our submit button is disabled if the form is invalid or Recaptcha is invalid or is not valid, right? So when that evaluates, we'll get the way to update our button if it assumes that we're not a robot. So let's go back and look at some of the actual markup here for our Recaptcha component. Now,
Hey, David, this might be a good time to talk about the decision to put your code in the Razor file versus in what we're calling the code behind. The deciding factor there. Go ahead with that.
Yeah. So as I mentioned before, like you could easily just have like an @code directive, and you could have code in here, and that's one way to do it. And both are, totally viable. I think the templating will actually do it this way, and it's a little bit of work to kind of go around and have a code behind with the partial class and stuff like that. The deciding factor for me is typically whether or not I want to have something that's a bit more complex and have more, I guess, finite control and not really mix concerns. So it seems as though the purist in me kind of fights to have the separation. So here's our templating markup. Go ahead.
I'm glad you provided that reason, because that's also a reason why I would put the code in another file.
Yeah.
I also find the tooling provides better support, better IntelliSense if you put that code in a separate file.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think this is probably one of those cases here where you'll see why I decided to have the code in a separate thing, because the markup here is, very, very elaborate, right? There's a div with an ID. That's all it is. So it's not elaborate at all, right? It's very, very simple. But the code behind itself, there's actually a lot going on. And the first thing I wanted to do is I wanted to say that this is actually inspired by this open source repository, Blazor-use Google Recaptcha. A lot of these bits were borrowed and inspired from that. So giving credit to this individual. But we have a sealed partial class Recaptcha. We're implementing idisposable. We're injecting the JavaScript runtime, and we'll be able to walk up to JavaScript and interact with it. And I'll show you what that looks like here in a second. We have the iOptions monitor, where we're taking the Recaptcha options, injecting those. We also have the HTTP client factory, and this client factory is used to instantiate our HTTP client instance that we're going to use to make callbacks from this component out to Google. And we have our parameter. Parameters can either be assigned or are assigned to from, as I mentioned before, from consuming components. So when our form is consuming this Recaptcha component, it can walk up to evaluated and define a callback that will handle that event callback. We've got our element ID, our options. So I'll show you a bit more here. All right, so on after render async, this occurs after the initial rendering, or after rendering occurs on the component, and we get a bool that says whether or not it's the first render. And if it's the first render, we're going to take our current value for our options, and we're going to wire on a change token for these options so that when they change, we'll update our options in case the component has its options changed at any point in time. And then we're going to call JavaScript.load Recaptcha async. And what this does is this is basically an extension method for our interop. So interop meaning that from our C# component, we can actually call into this interface, the IJS runtime. And the JS runtime actually represents the corresponding JavaScript runtime instance for the client of that request and response at a point in time. So we can then walk up to invoking it asynchronously. So we're going to say Recaptcha load.
So David, I have a question. So just if you can clarify for me. So this code that you're pointing out right here is running on the server, right?
Yep.
Okay, so when you call that invoke void async recaptcha.load, that is sending a signal down through the SignalR wire to the client to say, hey, go invoke this JavaScript on the client, right?
Yep.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, one thing I'd point out here, this is proof that Blazor is not setting out to kill JavaScript. Some of us might want it to. However, what I'm pointing out here is you can call JavaScript from .NET. You can also call .NET from JavaScript through Blazor, thanks to this JavaScript interop functionality. And what that means is, let's say you have a real-world application that your team is maintaining. Maybe that was written in React or Angular. And you decide that moving forward, we'd rather not write JavaScript. We want to start creating Blazor components. The two can happily coexist, those two being your Angular and React components with the Blazor components. Again, thanks to the JavaScript interop.
Yeah, absolutely. And what we're going to show here in just a second is from our C#, we're calling out into JavaScript. And then later on, we're actually having JavaScript call back into our C#. So it's a duplex communication, again, relying entirely on David Fowler's foundation, which is SignalR and SignalR core. So yeah, we call load, and there's this recaptcha.load function. And basically there's this component JavaScript that gets registered with this component, and we have this load functionality. So when we say load, what we're doing is we're walking up to our document and we're getting all the script tags, and we're checking to see if there's any script tag that already exists with Google's Recaptcha API. And if there's not, what we're going to do is we're going to add one, and we're going to defer it asynchronously and append it to the head and put the script back in there and make sure that basically it's just a way to lazily ensure that the client browser does in fact have the Google Recaptcha API JavaScript on the client. Then hit Control- and go back. Come on. Do it again. All right. Then we're going to, after loading, we're going to call render. So we're going to walk right back up to JavaScript, and we're going to say render Recaptcha async. And we're going to pass in this. So this is pretty interesting here. So what is this? This is our Recaptcha Blazor component. So that's the component itself. We're also going to pass in the element ID, so it knows what element in the DOM we care about. And we also have these options, which are the site key. So one thing I forgot to show you was our options are a site key and a secret key. And these two things are used for validating the API calls out to Google. You'll need to get those from Google and configure them.
Basically an ID and password, right?
Yeah, essentially. So then we call render Recaptcha, and render takes the instance and the element ID, where the instance is a class, and our site key, and we invoke and we return an int. But we call render, and we pass in the instance, which is the component, if you recall, but we have to actually wrap it in this .NET object reference .create. So this is very important, this create functionality. So what that does is it creates a .NET object reference that the client browser, the Blazor bits on the client can actually then understand and know how to call back into from the client to the server. So from the component again, since we're jumping back out there, we're calling the render functionality. So it gets this instance of the .NET object, the ID, which is from the DOM, and the site key. So if Google Recaptcha is present, and that's just a little bit that's letting us know that the JavaScript file is there and it's available, we're going to say document query selector given our interpolated string, which is the ID, basically the identifier selector for that DOM element. So we're going to get that element. And once we have it, we're going to return the Google Recaptcha rendering where we pass the element. And then we have this object literal. And this object literal is a well-known kind of object from Google Recaptcha, where they're going to take the site key and they're going to take a callback. And the callback is defined as a fat arrow function. So we have a response, and we're going to use our .NET object, and we're going to then invoke a method asynchronously, and we're going to call the onEvaluated. and pass it the response. So
just for my own clarification, this is the reverse of what you showed us a second ago, right? This is JavaScript saying, okay, now I'm going to invoke something in the C# code on the server.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay.
So, and they'll pass the response, and then it's going to call into onEvaluated. If it expires, though, we can call onExpired. And if we go back to our component, we'll see that we have this JS invocable. This is another thing that's important. We have to decorate these functions as such so that the instance on the client, the .NET object reference, understands what it can actually call back into because it's decorated that way. So it says, basically this attribute is used when the .NET object reference.create creates an instance of our object that can be marshaled back over, from interop, from JavaScript to C#. So it uses this attribute to trigger that. So then onEvaluated can be called. We get the Recaptcha response. And if our evaluated thing has a delegate, meaning someone has assigned to it, they're registered to handle that callback, we can instantiate a form URL encoded content where we have our secret, which is our secret key now, and the response payload. And then we're going to create a client from our factory and post out to the verification endpoint of Google Recaptcha, given our content, right?
Wait, so that again is the server doing this, right? So this is
Yep.
So like, whereas a lot of websites would use like their what's it called? XML, HTTP, whatever, to make that request to Google. The server is making it on the client's behalf in this case.
Yeah,
that's crazy.
Yeah, so it's probably a lot more hoops to jump through, but it just kind of illustrates all of the different moving parts and all of the capabilities that are out there. So you're only limited really by your own imagination. Like, you can do all these things. The tooling there, it's supported. There's more than one way to skin a cat, so to speak.
What kind of sick person are you?
That's a saying, right?
Sorry.
So then we get our response as a string. We serialize it from JSON to our Recaptcha verification response. And then we call back out to our evaluated. So we invoke that asynchronously and say it's valid or it's not valid and why. So once that happens, the client form then, no animals were harmed. That's true. So yeah, so let me just kind of recap all of the things that just really happened there. So once we did our idea and we filled out all the stuff, right? So the loading happened. That means that the JavaScript was brought down and ensured that it was here on the client. I enter the form, I fill things out, things happen. I say David Pine 6 because I like to be humorous. And then I click on this. Before I click there, I'm going to kind of verbalize what's going to happen. I'm going to click on it. And since we've rendered our callback, so actually taking a step back, the client verifies that the JavaScript is there, and then it renders it with the Google Recaptcha. So basically it's calling into and setting up our .NET object reference. So it already has an instance of our object, our Recaptcha component on the client that it can then marshal calls back into from JavaScript. So I'm going to hit this, and then the callback's going to occur, and then JavaScript is going to fire when this event happens, and it's going to say, okay, go validate whether or not we think this is a good response. And then it's going to send off and do an API call, sending a SignalR communication from the client to the server. The server is going to get that, and it's going to fire out using that string response to Google's endpoint and say, is this a valid response, yes or no? Is the person not a robot? It comes back, and then over SignalR again, it communicates that there's these deltas. Now the button can be enabled. So all of that in a single little click. Yeah, so there's other, what else can we show off? Let's see.
So you said that's not a NuGet package. You said that's just like sitting in this repository.
Yeah.
Why isn't it a NuGet package? It should be a NuGet package.
Well, I mean, it's only using, I think, V2 or V3. Recaptcha's come out with another version of it. Since there's different models for Blazor, the component wouldn't work for both. So you'd have to do a component for Blazor server side and one for WebAssembly. And then you might want to consider upgrading to the latest version of Recaptcha. So there's some different things, there's some different nuances, but it could certainly be done. And it could then be, something that's published and consumable. And all you have to do is provide your configuration, your options like that, and then you can reference it and it just works, right?
Mm-hmm.
One thing I think we should touch on, because I've seen this several times now in the code that you've been showing off, is the concept of nullable reference types in C#. I don't recall which file I saw it in, but if you could pull up an example, maybe talk through that, like why we're doing it, what benefits it provides.
Yeah, absolutely. So with C#8, the concept of nullable reference types was introduced, and I have to admit that when it first came out, I was like, well, wait a second, how does this make sense? Reference types have always been nullable, right? Yeah, they added nullable as a construct around value types, and that made sense because those had default values and can never be null, but they introduced that a long time ago. But with reference types, they've always been nullable. So really what this is it's taking some of the intuitions from the Rosin compiler and allowing your code to be a little bit safer in terms of the warnings that are provided based on your intentions. So you can express how you want things to be, and the IDE is smart enough to kind of infer your intentions and your expressions and heed them and take warning and provide sort of a better flow analysis and look at whether things are definitely assigned and stuff like that. So
but there's a huge disclaimer here, and that is nullable reference types are actually disabled out of the box.
Right.
You would opt into these. So maybe we should start there, David, and show how you would opt into this feature if you're even interested.
So I, by default, just right-clicked on this, and I always want to right-click and then do edit project. But I remember, Scott, you had shown me this, where if you just actually double-click on it, now the default is that it goes right to the editing, which is a nice thing.
So that there is actually a newer feature available to the new SDK style projects in .NET, where you can just double click and it will allow you to edit the project file.
And I remember when they showed it off in one of those internal showcases for what's getting released in the next version of Visual Studio, there was literally a standing ovation.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a pretty neat feature.
Yeah, because prior to that, you would have to right click, as David showed, unload the project, then edit the project. Ain't nobody got time for that.
Ain't nobody got time for that. So now, yeah, you just double click into it. So there's multiple ways that you could really enable the nullable context. The way that I prefer to do it is holistically for the project. So at the top level property group, I always will add a nullable enable. But basically this is going to enable the nullable context for this project. And so we're actually targeting .NET Standard 2.1 in this case, and this is actually required for nullable context. Since it came with C#8, you need 2.1 or I think ASP.NET Core 3.1. Basically anything that 2.1 maps to, any of those different runtimes. So let's go take a look at the nullable context stuff specifically. So when we specify, let's find something here that's nullable. All right, so here's a good example of two different things. So this one, the calendar invite ID, I declare as nullable. And this one I say is not null, right? So the guest stream URL, this cannot be null. So that's me expressing my intent for these two properties on this object. So I actually have to say, I'm going to remove that. That was null bang. I actually have to remove that. Otherwise, the IDE should get mad at me. Come on. Save. Do I have to save? I'm not going to do it. It's going to make me a liar. It is. It's going to make me a liar. Anyways, it should be warning me. It should be saying, you haven't assigned to this, but you're basically declaring it such that it can't be nullable, and you have nullable context enabled for your project. So
won't it throw a warning if you try to build?
No, there should. I mean, yeah, there should be build warnings, but it should just be also static analysis.
Well, right.
Let me
I'm just saying, thinking about like how you could goose it a little to.
Let me press buttons and hope for the best. Watch there be a bunch of build warnings, and people are like, "What? This project's terrible. This is terrible. So bad."
Anything that goes wrong in this demo can be blamed on JavaScript.
Yeah. No JavaScript was harmed in the filming of this episode. All right, wait for it.
Is that a bonus?
Maybe. Come
So,
on.
David, my understanding is this is a build time only feature. In other words, these nullable reference checks would not occur at runtime.
Right, that is correct. So we did get those warnings here, and we can see that. So I'm gonna toggle back out. So it did take me there. It's doing it on the constructor. So it's saying a non-nullable property guest stream URL is uninitialized. Consider declaring the property as nullable, right? But I don't want to declare it as nullable because I want to have form validation that will ensure that the client is in fact hydrating that field, or I'm ensuring it by knowing that my objects that are being hydrated out of Cosmos DB are going to populate that field. So instead, what I can do when I define this property is I can say the property initializer, I can equal or assign that rather to null. And instead of saying null, I actually have to say null right here. You cannot convert null literal to non-nullable reference type. So what we have to do is we have to say, damn it, it is null, right? That's the damn it operator. And basically it's a bang, and you say null bang, or you could say like even default bang. And these are different ways to kind of declaratively define your intent. So again, to recap, because nullable context is enabled, some things can be specified as nullable, and that's okay. Some things that are not nullable, how can you, someone says, how can you assign a null value to a non-nullable property? By using the damn it operator. That's literally what we're showing here. So when we say null, you get those warnings, right? So basically, to avoid that warning, you can just say null bang. And you're basically telling the compiler that you know better, that this is the initial state. But then from the outside, consumers of this, they'll get the same type of statement completion and flow analysis and all of those things that, damn it. Damn it.
For any South Park fans out there, this is essentially you as the developer telling the code, whatever, I do what I want.
Whatever, I do it. Oh, I love
Respect
it.
my authority.
It's a power move. It's you saying you are confident in your decisions. With that exclamation point, you are entirely confident that that's the behavior that you want.
Absolutely. So let's look at some other really cool C# 8 stuff, and they added what is referred to as switch expressions. So this is a kind of cool little thing. So we've got this extension method for the DocsShow. So we're going to walk up to a show instance, and we're going to do some cool stuff with it. We're going to say if it's not scheduled, the date is going to be determined, right? But otherwise, we're going to do a little bit of calculations on the date itself. Let's close that. And so we can calculate a date string given our offset, days, and seconds. Let me minimize that. So then we can express this static local function is expressed as a switch expression, where if the days are 0, we're going to calculate the second string, and that's down here. But if the day is 1, that means it was yesterday. Otherwise, we have some generic discards. So any other case down here, but also matching these other things. So when 2 to 7, which is I think it's an inclusive range, dot contains, and dot contains is an extension method on the range type. So when you're between 2 and 7 days, we can say that number of days ago. Otherwise, if you're between 8 and 31, we'll do a little bit of math, and we'll say that's the number of weeks ago. Otherwise, we'll just show the date. And you see that functionality in action when we look at the shows here. So this one was yesterday. This one was 2 weeks ago. This one was apparently also 2 weeks ago, which doesn't seem right. This was 4 weeks ago, 5 weeks ago, and then we get into showing just the dates at that point in time, the further out we get.
There's actually a story here. So we had an episode with John Skeets where he was the guest, and we knew we had issues with our date time implementation in this application. We had John Skeet take a look, and there was one file in particular. I don't recall if it was this one, but he essentially said, "Yes, delete all of this. It is all wrong. Just delete it."
Yeah, it was really entertaining. That was it's a great episode. We hope you check it out. Yeah, and I learned a lot from it. He's a wizard when it comes to that sort of thing. And that, I think that was the date time service one, so not this one specifically. But yes, there's plenty of room for improvement. But yeah, that's basically, I don't know. There's more stuff we could look at, I suppose, but I don't know. There hasn't been much questions besides a few. I think maybe we could call it or get close to calling it. Let's see. I mean, we've done the demo. We do have resources. So again, if you're watching this and you're curious, want to take a deeper dive, look at the stuff on your own, I encourage you to do so. Again, it's at ievangelist.net docs.show. And then we also have a link here. This is where we kind of talked about some of the different Blazor bits for the hosting models and how they're different. There's the server side and then WebAssembly. And then just recently on our show, we had someone talking about Maui and, native Blazor for mobile development and stuff like that. So there's a lot of other things that I guess Blazor is being planned for. So with that, I think, thank you very much. Unless, Steve, you have any questions or you want to poo-poo our code as well, or?
No, your code's perfect.
Awesome.
No, just a huge thank you to you guys for jumping on and showing us some of that stuff. It's been good, and sort of for regular .NET Southeast attendees, we'll hopefully be back next month. I'll get something scheduled with some other cool speakers, and
well, we hope to see everybody on our stream. Show the link slide again, please. Here, I can do that.
Oh.
Wait, or was it the previous slide? That one's pretty easy. I think it was the previous one that he made. That one. Yeah, there we go. Just to remind everybody, we stream the three of us, or we do have two other hosts in our host rotation. We stream on Mondays on the Visual Studio Twitch channel or the .NET YouTube channel at 1600 Universal Coordinated Time. Although I guess that probably changes when we change our clocks, doesn't it?
Probably. We have to ask John Skeet. Might want to message him about daytime stuff.
Can we phone a friend on the stream?
Calling Skeet. That's the episode name. Awesome. Well, this has been great. Thank you again so much to everyone who was watching. Thank you again, Steve, for having us on. Always a pleasure. Hopefully we can do this again.
Thanks, everyone.
So long, everybody.
Absolutely. Thank you.